The man known to history as King Leonidas I of Sparta was born around 540 BC in the Greek city-state which he would one day rule. His father was Anaxandridas II, the 15th king of the Aegeid line, who ruled Sparta for nearly 40 years between around 560 BC and 520 BC. Together with his co-king Ariston, Anaxandridas ruled Sparta during a time when it cemented its position as the most powerful city-state in the Greek world. The name of Leonidas's mother is unknown, but according to the near-contemporary Greek historian Herodotus, she was the niece of her husband Anaxandridas. After several years of marriage, she had not produced an heir, prompting the powerful Council of Ephors, the most powerful magistrates in Sparta next to the kings, to demand that Anaxandridas divorce her and marry a woman who could bear children. When Anaxandridas refused to do so, the Ephors allowed him to take a second wife while remaining married to his first. The king's new wife soon gave him his first son, a boy named Cleomenes. After he obtained his desired heir by his second wife, Anaxandridas returned to his first wife, who then surprisingly gave birth to 3 sons in quick succession: Dorius, Leonidas, and Cleombrotus. Leonidas was born into the Aegeid dynasty, the senior of the 2 lines of kings who jointly ruled over Sparta, both of whom claimed descent from the legendary hero Heracles. As the 3rd son of King Anaxandridas II, he was not expected to become king, but he would, in the end, succeed to the kingship and become one of the most legendary figures of classical antiquity. Despite this reputation, little is known about Leonidas's life, and the main source of what we do know comes from the histories of Herodotus, the 5th century BC historian nicknamed the Father of History, who was the first writer to take an investigative approach towards events of the past. However, Herodotus was also notorious for embellishing his accounts of Greek history, and this makes determining the details of Leonidas's life additionally difficult. The city-state of Sparta, also known by the ancient Greeks as Lacedaemon, was located on the Eurotas River in the southeastern portion of the Peloponnese, the peninsula connected to the rest of Greece via the Isthmus of Corinth. The Peloponnese had been settled by the Achaeans, one of the 4 major Greek ethnic groups, during the early period of Greek history. Sparta was home to the legendary King Menelaus, who led the Spartans in the Trojan War and fought to rescue his wife Helen after her abduction by the Trojan prince Paris. Menelaus is said to have ruled from the hilltop town of Therapne, while classical Sparta was founded on lower ground near the Eurotas by the Dorians from the east. Unlike other Greek city-states, Sparta was not properly urbanized and was more of a collection of villages. The town of Sparta itself was divided into the 4 villages of Petana, Limnae, Mossoa, and Cynosura. The 4 villages, together with that of Amyclae to the south, collectively formed the city-state of Sparta. Since the 900s BC, Sparta was jointly ruled by 2 kings of the Aegeid and Europontid dynasties. The Spartans owed their constitution, known as the Great Retra, to a legendary figure called Lycurgus, who is said to have introduced his reforms around the 7th century BC. Under this system, the 2 kings of Sparta served as commanders of the army and were also members of the Gerousia, a council of elders whose membership included 28 other men aged at least 60 who were elected for life. In addition to serving as the Supreme Court, the Gerousia debated political issues before they were put to a vote in the assembly. They also had the power to veto the assembly's decisions. The members of the assembly were Sparta's full citizens, all of whom had to be of legitimate Spartan birth, and each underwent a rigorous training regime to serve in the Spartan army during their youth. Every year, the assembly elected a council of 5 ephors, one for each of the 5 villages who shared executive power with the kings, and sometimes overruled them. The ephors had extensive powers over foreign relations and served as ambassadors. Additionally, 2 ephors would always accompany the king on military campaigns and could put him on trial for misconduct. By the middle of the 7th century BC, Sparta had a formidable hoplite army. Hoplites were heavy infantrymen who fought in phalanxes 8 ranks deep, distinguished by a wooden round shield, faced in bronze and decorated with the Greek letter lambda for Lacedaemon, which they carried on their left arm. They wore a large bronze helmet, a bronze breastplate, bronze abdominal guard, and greaves. Their main weapon was a long wooden spear with an iron tip, and they also carried a short sword for close combat. Spartan hoplites were distinguished from other Greek warriors by their long hair and long red cloaks. Sparta was a very religious society, and its kings would make sacrifices and consult oracles before going on campaign. Even in the heat of battle, Spartan commanders were known to take time to make sacrifices to inform their decisions. They had a unique attitude to death, considering it a badge of honor to be killed in battle, while survival in defeat was a humiliation. These customs and values were instilled into the Spartans from a young age. As a warrior society, boys of legitimate Spartan birth were separated from their families from the age of 7 and brought up in the compulsory agoge system, where they would be raised by young Spartan adults who trained them as warriors. At the age of 18, the graduates with the greatest potential would join an elite military unit who served as members of the royal bodyguard of 300 men, senior army commanders, and would eventually become candidates for the Gerousia. The only Spartan boys exempted from the agoge were the crown princes of the 2 royal houses. As Leonidas was not his father's eldest son, he would have joined his brothers Dorius and Cleombrotus in the arduous training regime. The elite Spartans were also members of a secret service called the Crypteia, whose main function was to control the Helots, the lower class of Spartan society who were effectively exploited as slaves, and had once been from neighboring states such as Messenia, which were brought under Spartan domination from the 8th century onwards. Since the Helots vastly outnumbered the Spartan constitution included measures to keep them under control. After a new set of ephors took office in the autumn, they would issue a declaration of war on the Helots, which allowed free Spartans to kill the Helots without being punished. A third class, which existed between the Spartans and Helots, were known as Perioeci, and these were men from neighboring towns and villages who were free subjects of the Spartans with obligations to serve in the army. As the Spartans were banned from engaging in any economic activities, the Perioeci served as merchants and craftsmen, making the armor and weapons for the Spartan military. Sparta was just one of over 1,000 city-states dotted around on the Mediterranean and Black Sea coasts, from the Straits of Gibraltar in the west to modern-day Georgia in the east, which collectively made up the Greek or Hellenic world. Although these communities were connected by a shared language, culture, and religion, they were independent entities who would often fight each other over control of land and economic resources. Most Greeks lived in Europe, but there was also a large population in Western Asia and a handful of settlements in North Africa along the coastline of places such as Cyrene, the ancient name for Libya. By the 6th century, many of these city-states had become democracies, but some continued to retain their kings or had been taken over by dictators and tyrants. Sparta was unique in being a diarchy with 2 kings. Around the time of Leonidas's birth, the most important and powerful city-states in mainland Greece included Thebes, Corinth, Argos, Sparta, and Athens. These city-states would then establish colonies further afield, some of which would become powerful city-states in their own right. Syracuse in Sicily was founded by Corinth. Ephesus in Turkey was founded by Athens, while modern-day Naples in Italy, which was known as Neapolis in ancient times, was initially settled by sailors from Rhodes. The only overseas colony founded by Sparta was that of Taras, modern-day Taranto in southern Italy. Unlike other Greek city-states, the Spartans satisfied the need for land by conquering the neighboring regions of Laconia and Messenia to the south and west. By the middle of the 6th century BC, the Spartans turned their attention to the region of Arcadia in the north. In around 550 BC, during the reign of Leonidas's father, Anaxandridas, the Spartans marched into battle against the Arcadian city-state of Tegea, carrying rods with which they would divide the land they expected to conquer, and chains to shackle the prisoners they expected to capture. Instead, they suffered an unexpected defeat and ended up wearing the same chains as prisoners of war. The setback at the so-called Battle of Fetters prompted Sparta to change its policy from one of conquest to one of diplomacy under the influence of an ephor named Chilon. The Spartans soon claimed to have discovered the bones of Orestes and Tisamenus, the legendary son and grandson of King Agamemnon, the elder brother of Menelaus, and supreme commander of the Greeks in the Trojan War. By bringing these remains back to Sparta for reburial, they claimed the inheritance of the Achaean kings, and by extension, the whole of the Peloponnese. Through these and other means, the Lacedaemonians were able to secure an alliance with Tegea. Over the course of the second half of the 6th century BC, these diplomatic initiatives led to the formation of an alliance known as the Peloponnesian League. Sparta was the leading power of the alliance and was not bound by reciprocal obligations to defend its allies. The one major Peloponnesian city-state which remained outside the League was Argos, a traditional rival which unsuccessfully challenged Spartan dominance in battle on several occasions in the 6th century BC. The death of Anaxandridas II in around 520 BC led to a succession crisis between his sons Cleomenes and Dorius. While Dorius claimed seniority as the son of his father's first wife, and on account of his military prowess by going through the Agoge, the Spartans kept a tradition and acknowledged their elder Cleomenes as the rightful king. After his failed attempt at claiming the crown for himself, Dorius tried unsuccessfully to found a Spartan colony in North Africa and later Sicily, but was killed in battle against the Carthaginians in Sicily in around 510 BC. Cleomenes proved to be an effective king whose influence extended across much of the Greek world. In 510 BC, he led a land invasion of Athens that resulted in the expulsion of the tyrant Hippias and his sons. The Spartan intervention enabled the Athenian politician Cleisthenes to establish a democratic government, and in 507 BC, Cleomenes responded to the calls of the pro-Spartan politician Isagoras to overthrow Cleisthenes and install an oligarchy. Although the Spartans managed to occupy the Athenian Acropolis, the people declared in favor of Cleisthenes and forced the Spartan king to withdraw, sending Isagoras into exile in the process. The failed intervention prompted Cleomenes to lead a large Peloponnesian army alongside his co-king of the Eurypontid royal house, Demaratus, against Athens the following year. The campaign of 506 BC proved unsuccessful when the army disintegrated after the Corinthians decided to withdraw their forces halfway through, following which King Demaratus also abandoned the army. Following the incident, Sparta agreed to create a Congress of the Peloponnesian League, where the allies could vote for or against military action. In order to prevent future disagreements on campaign, the Spartans also changed their constitution, forbidding the two reigning kings from leading the Spartan army on campaign together at the same time. According to Herodotus, the Agiad and Eurypontid kings of Sparta tended to view each other with suspicion and hatred, and after 506 BC, the disagreements between Cleomenes and Demaratus were not only political but personal. This animosity continued for many years. In 494 BC, after defeating Argos in battle, Cleomenes was put on trial for failing to capture Argos itself. It is likely that Demaratus was behind the initiative. On this occasion, Cleomenes successfully defended himself and was acquitted when placed on trial before the ephors. Then, in 491 BC, following another disagreement between the two men, Cleomenes deposed his co-king and bribed the oracle at Delphi to declare that Demaratus was the illegitimate son of his father, King Ariston, and therefore his deposition was divinely sanctioned. Soon afterwards, the bribery was discovered, and Cleomenes is said to have gone mad and went into exile. He was then recalled to Sparta and arrested by the authorities. His accusers on this latter occasion may have included his brothers Leonidas and Cleombrotus. After being placed in prison with a helot guard, he soon persuaded one of the guards to give him a knife and killed himself. Herodotus presents a number of alternative theories for the king's madness and suicide, the most common being that he had angered the gods when he bribed the oracle at Delphi, and his descent into insanity was divine retribution. The historian Paul Cartledge has raised the possibility that Cleomenes' death was not a suicide, but that he was actually murdered by his half-brother Leonidas, who was next in line to the Aegean throne and who succeeded Cleomenes as King Leonidas I in 489 BC. By the time he became king, Leonidas was married to Gorgo, the daughter and only child of Cleomenes. As Gorgo was born around 510 BC, the marriage would have taken place in the late 490s, when Gorgo was in her late teens and Leonidas was already around 50 years old. Marriage between close blood relatives was not uncommon for the Spartan royal houses, and Leonidas's own father and mother had been uncle and niece. Furthermore, as Gorgo was Cleomenes' only child and stood to inherit all his wealth, Leonidas would reunite a large part of his father's inheritance that had been divided among his 4 sons. Leonidas came to the throne towards the beginning of the Greco-Persian Wars, which saw Greek city-states in Ionia on the western coast of modern-day Turkey clash with the rapidly expanding Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was founded in the 550s BC by Cyrus II of Anshan, a client king of the Median Empire, ruled by his maternal grandfather, King Astyages. Both of these empires were based initially out of the region around modern-day Iran. In 553 BC, Cyrus rebelled against his grandfather, and by 550 BC, he captured the Median capital of Ecbatana, overthrowing Astyages' empire and proclaiming himself King of Kings. Upon learning of this, King Croesus of Lydia in western Anatolia, the region around western Turkey along the coast of the Aegean Sea, sought to take advantage of the collapse of the Medes and consulted the Delphic oracle, which informed him that he would destroy a great empire if he were to launch an invasion. Confident of victory, Croesus invaded Cyrus's empire from the west, only for the Persian king to counterattack and overrun Lydia by 546 BC, deposing Croesus and transforming the region into a Persian province. In 539 BC, Cyrus also captured Babylon and allowed the captive Jewish population to return to their ancestral home in Jerusalem. The great king then turned his attention east, where he managed to establish tributary relationships in India, but generally faced greater resistance. He is said to have died in battle in Central Asia, fighting against an army led by Queen Tomiris of the Massagetae in 530 BC. The Persian Empire continued its expansion under Cyrus's son and successor, Cambyses II, who conquered Egypt and the Levant during his brief reign. Cambyses' death in 522 BC led to a power struggle which eventually resulted in the accession of Darius I, a powerful warrior who married Cyrus's daughter Atossa and claimed to be distantly related to the Persian royal house. After his coronation at Cyrus's capital of Pasargadae in around 515 BC, he established a ceremonial capital at Persepolis in the region of Fars in southern Iran, though the main administrative center was in Susa, around 160 miles to the east of the Tigris River. In 513 BC, Darius embarked on his Scythian campaign, during which he built a pontoon bridge to convey his army across the Bosporus Straits into European Thrace, a region covering parts of modern-day Bulgaria, northwestern Turkey, and northeastern Greece. Although he struggled to defeat the nomadic Scythians, Darius subjugated the Thracians and forced King Amyntas of Macedonia to submit to his empire as a vassal. These new conquests strengthened the Persian Empire's northwest frontier and served as a base for further incursions into Greece. By 500 BC, Darius ruled over a vast multi-ethnic empire, which incorporated Indians in the east and Greeks in the west, and he set about reorganizing his father-in-law's disparate conquests in order to administer the provinces more effectively. Darius introduced a universal currency known as the Daric in his honor. He also divided the empire into around 20 provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap. Each of these governors was required to provide a minimum annual tax or tribute as well as military obligations, and the satraps were expected to collect these taxes and raise contingents of soldiers on behalf of the great king. Although the Persian kings were Zoroastrians, who claimed to be representatives of the god Ahura Mazda, or Lord Wisdom, they were generally tolerant of other religions, and were satisfied as long as they received the taxes and tributes they demanded from their imperial subjects in each of the provinces. By the end of the 6th century BC, many of the Greeks in the Persian Empire in Lydia and Ionia were unhappy with Persian rule, and in 499 BC, the Ionian revolt broke out under the leadership of Aristagoras, tyrant of the city-state of Miletus in southwestern Anatolia. Although several Greek regions rose up in revolt, the rebels needed alliances with the powerful city-states on the Greek mainland in order to stand any chance of defeating the mighty Persian Empire. Aristagoras personally went to Sparta to ask for aid from King Cleomenes, claiming untruthfully that the Persians could be easily defeated. This was not the first time the Spartans had received a request for military assistance against the Persians. A half-century earlier, King Croesus of Lydia had recognized Sparta as the most powerful city-state in the Greek world, and when he faced a counter-invasion of Lydia by Cyrus's armies in the 440s BC, Croesus requested military assistance from Sparta, which on this occasion decided to only send a diplomatic envoy to warn Cyrus not to invade Lydia. By the time the Spartan arrived, Cyrus had already occupied the Lydian capital of Sardis. When Cleomenes asked how long it would take to get to Persia, Aristagoras informed him that it would take 3 months to march overland from Ionia to Susa. When Cleomenes refused, due to the great distances involved, Aristagoras informed the Spartan king of the great wealth of the Persian Empire and attempted to bribe him, gradually increasing his offer. According to Herodotus, Aristagoras eventually offered Cleomenes 50 talents of silver, an enormous sum of money at the time, but Cleomenes' daughter, and Leonidas's future wife Gorgo, who was not yet 10 years old, warned her father not to become corrupt and urged him to dismiss the foreigner. After Sparta's refusal to help, Aristagoras went to Athens and made the same arguments in an attempt to obtain Athenian assistance. As the Athenians claimed leadership of the Ionian Greeks and had recently survived attempts by the former tyrant Hippias to overthrow their nascent democracy with Persian support, they agreed to support the revolt and joined the Ionians and Eretrians in sacking the Lydian capital of Sardis in 498 BC. Later that year, the allies were defeated by the Persians at the Battle of Ephesus, and Athens withdrew from the alliance. The revolt continued until 494 BC, when a Persian fleet defeated the Ionians at the naval battle of Lade, near Miletus. After restoring his control over Ionia, Darius planned an invasion of Greece, both to punish Athens and Eretria for siding with the rebels and to reduce the threat of the Greek city-states joining together to attack the empire again. Thus, in 492 BC, Darius's son-in-law and nephew, Mardonius, led a campaign to re-establish Persian authority over Thrace and forced Macedonia to give up its previous autonomy. But any further incursions into Greece were frustrated when most of the Persian fleet was shipwrecked near Mount Athos. The following year, the Persian king sent ambassadors to all the Greek states seeking their submission to Persian authority. Athens and Sparta signaled their refusal to submit by killing the Persian envoys, but a direct showdown between the Greeks and the Persians was drawing near. In 491 BC, King Cleomenes of Sparta had tried to use his influence to create an anti-Persian alliance between Athens and the nearby island city-state of Aegina, which had recently submitted to Persia. But his efforts at fostering Greek unity against the Persian threat were undermined by King Demaratus back home in Sparta, who criticized his co-king for siding with Athens, a traditional enemy against Aegina, a long-standing ally of Sparta. Demaratus' conspiring against Cleomenes led directly to the latter maneuvering to depose the former. After being mocked in public by his successor Leotychitus II, Demaratus left Sparta and took refuge in Persia, where he was given land by King Darius. In 490 BC, Darius launched an amphibious invasion of Greece, led by his nephew Artaphanes and a general named Datis. After easily subduing Eretria and burning the city to the ground, the Persians turned their attention to Athens. Although the Athenians were an emerging naval power, they did not yet have the capability to prevent the Persian army from landing at the Bay of Marathon, around 25 miles to the east from Athens. The Athenians sent the long-distance runner Phidippides to request help from Sparta. It's uncertain if Cleomenes or Leonidas was king at the time, but when the Athenian arrived after running over 150 miles in 48 hours, the Spartans agreed to send 2,000 hoplites. However, they stated that they could not leave until a religious festival which was being celebrated in Sparta at the time was over. As a result, by the time these Spartans arrived, the Athenians and Persians had already fought the Battle of Marathon. The Athenian army was commanded by Miltiades, who had previously ruled over an Athenian colony in Thrace and fought under Darius in his Scythian campaign of 513 BC, before siding with Aristagoras in the Ionian Revolt. Armed with his experience of Persian warfare, Miltiades deployed his army to block the exits of the plain of Marathon. After several days, the Persians decided to sail their army straight to Athens. While the Persian cavalry were embarking from their ships, Miltiades led his army of 10,000 men to attack the flanks of the Persian infantry before turning towards the center. Over 6,000 Persians were killed during the battle, at the cost of 192 Athenian dead, and an unknown number of casualties among Athens' allies from the city of Plataea. The Persians abandoned their ambitions to conquer Athens and returned home. This was the background against which Leonidas became one of Sparta's two kings. Not much is known about what happened in Sparta in the 480s BC after Leonidas became king. Although the Persians had been defeated at Marathon, the Spartans, Athenians, and others fully expected that they would return before long. Darius died in 486 BC, without fulfilling his ambitions to conquer Greece, and was succeeded by his son Xerxes. After restoring internal order within his empire, he resolved to complete his father's unfinished work and made preparations for a campaign to defeat and subjugate the Greeks once and for all. News of these preparations reached Sparta in around 484 BC. Regretting the earlier decision to kill the Persian envoy sent by Darius in 491 BC, the Spartans decided to send a human sacrifice to the Persians in an attempt to appease the gods for their sacrilegious deeds 7 years earlier. 2 men volunteered for the sacrificial mission, and both were sent on the journey. But when they arrived at Xerxes' court at Susa and informed the great king of the proposed sacrifice, Xerxes laughed and considered it a joke. The cultural misunderstanding may have spared the lives of the 2 Spartans, but preparations for the invasion of Greece continued as before. As part of his preparations, Xerxes ordered a canal to be dug through Mount Athos in northeastern Greece, hoping to prevent a repeat of the disaster when the Persian fleet had attempted to go round the Athos promontory during Mardonius's invasion of 492 BC. Xerxes also ordered the construction of a bridge of boats across the Bosporus or Hellespont, like Darius had done more than 20 years earlier when he first conquered Thrace. Unlike his father, Xerxes took steps to prevent any sabotage of these invasion plans by ensuring that his Greek subjects were not involved in the project. Instead, he ordered his Phoenician and Egyptian subjects to chain the boats together with thick papyrus rope. Xerxes could also count on a large contingent of Greek subjects, including the Thracians and Macedonians. Many Greek city-states which retained monarchies preferred the protection offered by the Persian Empire to the prospect of being overthrown by a democratic revolution, and despite attempts by Herodotus to give the impression of a united Greek resistance to this latest Persian invasion, it is likely that more Greeks fought for Xerxes than against him when he launched the latest Persian invasion of Greece in 480 BC. Sparta was the first of the Greek city-states to be warned of an imminent Persian invasion. According to Herodotus, the deposed king Demaratus, who was in exile in the Persian Empire, continued to sympathize with his native land and decided to send a warning to Sparta. In order to keep the message secret, he inscribed it on a wooden tablet which he covered with wax to conceal the message. When the item arrived in Sparta, everyone was confused as to what it meant, but Leonidas's wife, Gorgo, suspected that there could be a hidden message underneath and suggested removing the wax. After the wax was burned away, Demaratus's message was revealed, and the Spartans passed on the warning to the other Greek city-states. While Sparta and its allies in the Peloponnesian League served as a powerful armed force on land, the Greeks continued to lack a major naval force. The Athenian political leader, Themistocles, who emerged as the most influential politician in Athens during the 480s BC, was a keen advocate for Athens to build its naval capacity in order to resist a Persian invasion fleet. In 483 BC, Themistocles exploited the discovery of a rich seam in the silver mines at Laurium and proposed to the Athenian assembly that the silver should be used to finance the construction of a fleet of 100 or 200 new triremes, the fast and agile warships named after their 3 tiers of oars. As the Persian threat was considered rather distant for the time being, Themistocles claimed that the fleet was to be used against Aegina, which had inflicted a series of naval defeats upon Athens since siding with the Persians in 491 BC. The assembly voted in favor of the proposal, allowing Athens to build a fleet capable of confronting the Persians. Thus, by the time Xerxes began his final preparations for the invasion of Greece in 480 BC, the oracle at Delphi was able to inform envoys from Athens that while their city would be destroyed, the wooden wall shall remain unconquered. While some Athenians claimed that the oracle referred to the hedges that used to surround the Acropolis, Themistocles convinced his fellow Athenians to place their faith in his navy, which he believed was the wooden wall, which the oracle was referring to as the salvation of Athens. In 481 BC, the representatives of the Greek city-states which sought to resist the imminent Persian invasion met at the Isthmus of Corinth, the narrow neck of land between the Peloponnese and northern Greece, where they agreed on a mutual defensive pact, bound as they were by religious, linguistic, and cultural ties. The alliance included 31 city-states, half of which were members of the Peloponnesian League or otherwise associated with Sparta. Given its preeminent position among the city-states, Sparta was the undisputed leader of the coalition, and Spartan military commanders would lead the allied Greek forces on both land and sea during the war, even though the Spartans were not known for their naval prowess. On land, however, there was no disputing King Leonidas's credentials to lead the allied army. In the spring of 480 BC, Xerxes finally led his invasion force across the pontoon bridges he had painstakingly constructed over the Hellespont in the past few years. While Herodotus claimed that the invasion force numbered over 2 million men, based on the capacity of the Persian Empire at the time, it is unlikely that Xerxes' army would have exceeded more than 200,000 men. Herodotus claims that the invasion force included up to 60 ethnic groups, including Persians, Medes, and Parthians from Iran, Bactrians from the region around modern-day Afghanistan, Indians from what is now the Punjab, as well as a wide array of other subject peoples, such as the Lydians, Arabians, Egyptians, Ethiopians, Libyans, and even many Greeks, The Persian force included the 10,000-strong royal bodyguard known as the Immortals, who were commanded by a nobleman named Hydarnes. According to Herodotus, the Persian fleet numbered over 1,000 ships, including large contingents from the Phoenicians, Egyptians, Cypriots, and more than 300 ships from the king's Asian Greek subjects. Among the latter were 5 warships commanded by a woman named Artemisia, who was queen of Halicarnassus. The large Persian army proceeded at a slow pace through northern Greece, partly as a result of the army's long supply train, and partly due to Xerxes' desire to use its imposing presence to present a sense of inevitable victory which would convince wavering Greeks to submit to Persian rule. In July, the Persians approached the Vale of the Tempe, on the border between Macedonia and Thessaly. An allied Greek army of 10,000 men, under the joint command of the Athenian Themistocles and a Spartan named Euanytus, awaited the invading force. When King Alexander I of Macedonia alerted the allied army of the imminent arrival of Xerxes, he informed Themistocles and Euanytus not only of the vast numbers of men and ships in the invading force, but also that the allied defenses could be outflanked. This information prompted the allied army to withdraw and return to the Isthmus of Corinth for further deliberations. The wavering Thessalians submitted easily to the Persians, allowing Xerxes to continue his march south without much difficulty. In the meantime, the Persian fleet sailed to Cape Sepias, opposite the island of Euboea. After withdrawing from their first defensive position, the Greek allies decided to resist the Persians by land at the pass of Thermopylae and by sea at nearby Cape Artemisium on the northern tip of Euboea. Despite the desperate military situation, the religious calendar proved a complicating factor for the Greek coalition, as the Olympic Games were due to be held that August. Held in honor of Zeus, king of the gods, the Olympian Games were one of 4 pan-Hellenic games which brought together athletes and spectators from all over the Greek world. Sparta's religious obligations were twofold, as they were also preparing for the annual Carneia festival in honor of the god Apollo. Nevertheless, as leaders of the anti-Persian coalition, the Spartans had to send an army to Thermopylae as a gesture of resistance. Otherwise, the coalition could easily fall apart, with individual city-states siding with Xerxes in the face of his advancing army. Furthermore, the Spartans had consulted the oracle at Delphi, which had informed them that either Sparta would be occupied by the Persians, or they would be mourning the death of a king. Guided by these considerations, Sparta sent King Leonidas and a small army of 300 hoplites for the defense of Thermopylae. Although this was a small percentage of the 8,000 or so Spartan warriors available, most of the 300 would have been part of the elite royal bodyguard. Leonidas also stipulated that the men who accompanied him were to have a living son, a sign perhaps that the king was convinced, perhaps owing to the oracle's declaration, that he and his 300 men were destined to die in battle. Accordingly, he wished to ensure that each of the 300 men's family line could be continued by their surviving sons. When Leonidas left for Thermopylae, he advised his wife Gorgo to, quote, marry a good man and have good sons, though they already had a young son of their own named Pleistarchus. With this done, Leonidas and the 300 marched to Thermopylae, perhaps aware that death awaited them there. It is this spirit which led 2 men to volunteer to sacrifice themselves to the Persians in the name of peace in 484 BC, only to be misunderstood by Xerxes. Such misunderstandings were less likely during Xerxes' invasion of 480 BC, as he had with him a prominent Spartan advisor, the same Demaratus who had been removed as king of Sparta by Cleomenes 11 years before. Earlier in the campaign, the great king asked him whether the Greeks would be motivated to resist. Demaratus replied that his fellow Spartans, quote, will fight as no others, no matter how few against however many, and that they were accustomed not to retreat from the battlefield even when outnumbered, to stay in formation, and either to win or to die. However, Xerxes foolishly dismissed the very notion that men would fight so courageously of their own volition. In addition to the 300 elite hoplites, the Spartan army also included around 1,000 perioeci and the same number of helots. These were reinforced by small contingents of Peloponnesian allies, allowing Leonidas to march to Thermopylae with around 4,000 men. As they approached the pass in northern Greece, the coalition army was joined by 1,100 Boeotians and contingents from the neighboring Locrians and Phocians, each of whom contributed around 1,000 men. Adding all these disparate contingents together, Leonidas commanded an army of some 7,000 men at Thermopylae, awaiting the Persian horde. The name Thermopylae means hot gates in Greek. This describes a narrow pass between the Kallidroman Massif, a mountain to the west, and the Gulf of Maliarchos to the east. There were 3 such gates through the region. Leonidas deployed most of his men at the middle gate, a 15 to 20 meter long stretch at the narrowest point of the pass. The gate was already protected by an existing Phocian wall, and upon their arrival, the Greeks began to refurbish it. Leonidas was soon informed by men from nearby Trachis that there was a narrow mountain path called Anapia, which snaked around the pass and emerged around the east gate to the rear of the Greek position. Accordingly, the Spartan king ordered his 1,000-strong Phocian contingent to guard the path, which was so narrow that in places men could only advance in single file. Any attempt by the Persian fleet to attack the Greek position from the sea was protected by the Greek fleet at Artemisium, commanded officially by the Spartan Eurybiades, but in effect by Themistocles. Leonidas's Peloponnesian allies may have hoped that Xerxes would not arrive until the end of the Olympic Games, and their home cities would have time to summon their full contingents to do battle at Thermopylae. But the Persian army arrived in mid-August, with the religious festivities still ongoing. At this juncture, the Peloponnesians suggested to Leonidas that they should withdraw to the Isthmus of Corinth and await further reinforcements there. The king of Sparta briefly considered this, but protests from the local Locrians and Phocians at the prospect of being abandoned to face the Persians alone prompted Leonidas to keep his army at Thermopylae, while sending messengers to allied city-states to request reinforcements as soon as possible. A famous incident occurred at this time when a soldier complained to Leonidas that the Persian army was so large that its arrows would blot out the sun. The Spartan king, unfazed by such a daunting prospect, remarked that if that were so, the Greeks would have a comfortable time fighting in the shade. However, Herodotus attributes the quote to a Spartan warrior named Dionysius. When Xerxes was deploying his army at the western end of the pass, he sent a scout on horseback to find out what the Greeks were up to. The scout returned to report that he had seen a small number of Greeks doing gymnastic exercises in the nude, while others were combing their long hair. The report astonished the great king, who summoned Demaratus to explain this seemingly effeminate behavior. Demaratus immediately recognized these men as Spartans and informed Xerxes that by dressing their hair, they were performing a ritual as part of their preparations to fight to the death. Xerxes had come to distrust Demaratus by this time, and took this warning lightly, dismissing the notion that these men were the boldest and noblest of all the Greeks. Expecting that sooner or later Leonidas and his men would take flight, Xerxes waited for 4 or 5 days until he finally decided to attack on the 17th of August, 480 BC. Before doing so, he sent an envoy to Leonidas, promising the Greeks their freedom and lands in Asia if they surrendered. After the Persian envoy was refused, he returned with a message from Xerxes, asking Leonidas and his men to hand over their weapons. In response, the king of Sparta uttered a characteristically brief 2-word challenge, "Molon labe," come and take them. Xerxes answered Leonidas's challenge by sending a 2,000-strong Median contingent who were among the best soldiers in his army against the Greeks. However, the lightly armed Medes were unable to make much progress, and hundreds fell as they clashed with the heavily armed Spartan hoplites. The Median javelins were much shorter than the hoplite spears, and the narrow confines of the pass at Thermopylae negated the advantage of numbers that the Persians enjoyed. The Spartans also enjoyed tactical superiority, and their high level of discipline enabled Leonidas to rotate his men at the front line behind the Phocian wall at regular intervals to ensure that the men fought as effectively as possible. Leonidas also successfully ordered his men to stage feigned retreats before wheeling them around and inflicting maximum damage on the enemy forces, which had begun to advance in a chaotic fashion. Increasingly frustrated by the inability of his army to overcome the resistance of a tiny Greek hoplite army, Xerxes ordered his elite immortals into the fray, but even they could make no progress against the wall of Spartan shields and fell back with heavy losses. Thus ended the first day of hostilities. Xerxes knew he had a genuine problem on his hands at the end of it. On the second day of battle, Xerxes continued his frontal assault of the pass, launching wave after wave of men against the Greek hoplite wall. As the Persian king rued a second day of no progress, a local man named Ephialtes arrived at the Persian camp, offering information that would enable the Persians to win the battle. Expecting a huge reward from the great king, the infamous traitor informed Xerxes that it was possible to circumvent the Greek position by taking the narrow Anopeia mountain path. Xerxes at once investigated this possibility and ordered Hydarnes to lead his immortals on a special mission. With Ephialtes serving as their guide, Hydarnes and his men set off at nightfall and climbed the mountain path in the middle of the night. During the early hours of the third day of battle, the Phocian contingent detached by Leonidas to guard the route heard the rustling of leaves signaling the unexpected advance of the immortals and hurried to arm themselves for battle. An equally surprised Hydarnes feared that these were Spartans, but after Ephialtes informed him that they were not, the immortals managed to overcome the inexperienced Phocian hoplites and descended into the Thermopylae Pass, east of the Middle Gate. As a result of these developments, on the morning of the third day, Leonidas and his men faced being trapped in a pincer to the east and west. When the Spartan royal diviner Megistias carried out his sacrifice that morning, he read the signs of impending death, which would hardly have come as a surprise. Leonidas and his subordinate commanders decided what to do, now that their position was untenable. The account given by Herodotus states that Leonidas dismissed his allies after recognizing that they were unwilling to continue the fight. The king himself decided to continue the fight with what remained of the 300 Spartans, the Perioeci and Helots, as well as the Boeotians, who chose to stay and fight. It is equally likely, perhaps more so, that the allied contingents withdrew in fear without any orders from Leonidas. That the Spartans decided to stay and fight until the bitter end was fully expected of their warrior culture, and Leonidas might also have been persuaded to stay by the message from the oracle that a Spartan king would have to die to spare Sparta from the Persian horde. As the remainder of his army prepared to take breakfast that morning, Leonidas is supposed to have said to them, "This evening we shall dine in Hades." After 9 o'clock on the morning of the third day of battle, Xerxes launched his assault. Leonidas and the remaining Greeks made their last stand in front of the Phocian wall. With nothing to lose except their lives, they fought like men possessed and inflicted more casualties on the enemy than in the previous 2 days. After their spears broke, the Greeks took their swords in hand and charged against the enemy, fighting hand to hand. King Leonidas fell in the melee, and the Greeks and Persians fought over possession of the dead king's body. Although the Greeks were initially successful at retrieving their fallen leader's corpse, once the outflanking maneuver was complete and they were trapped in the rear, the remaining Greeks retreated to a small hill where they fought to the end, with only the Thebans surrendering to the Persians. Of the 300 Spartans who accompanied Leonidas to Thermopylae, only 2 survived, neither of whom fought in the battle. A man named Pantites had been absent because Leonidas sent him on a diplomatic mission to Thessaly, and when he realized he missed the battle, he hanged himself in shame. A second man, Aristodemus, was unable to fight due to an eye infection, even though a fellow member of the 300, named Eurytus, had been suffering from the same illness. He ordered his helot attendant to lead him into the battle, acting as his eyes on the battlefield, where he met his end. Upon his return to Sparta, Aristodemus was subjected to humiliation from his fellow citizens, and at the Battle of Plataea the following year, he attempted to redeem himself by breaking ranks and charging alone into the midst of the enemy. Although the Greeks lost up to 4,000 men at Thermopylae, over 20,000 Persians fell during the battle, including 2 of Xerxes' half-brothers. Infuriated by how much blood he had to expend in order to eliminate such a small enemy force, once the Persians recaptured Leonidas's body, Xerxes ordered the dead king to be decapitated and his head displayed on top of a pole. Herodotus noted that the Persians usually treated the bodies of fallen enemy warriors with great honor, indicating exactly how enraged Xerxes was by how Leonidas had managed to oversee the resistance at Thermopylae. The death of Leonidas led to the accession of his young son Pleistarchus as king. The fallen king's younger brother, Cleombrotus, was named regent for the underage Pleistarchus and also took over command of the coalition land forces in the Peloponnese. While Leonidas and his small army fought at Thermopylae, 271 Greek triremes fought with a Persian fleet of up to 800 ships at Artemisium. On the first day of battle, the Greeks sank 30 enemy ships, while a Persian detachment sent around the eastern coast of Euboea to outflank the Greeks was shipwrecked. After a day of relative calm, the Persian fleet launched a sustained assault on the Greek fleet, and both sides incurred considerable damage over the course of the day. When Themistocles received news of the defeat at Thermopylae, he realized that there was no longer any strategic value in remaining at Artemisium, and ordered the fleet to withdraw to Salamis on the Saronic Gulf to the west of Athens. On land, Cleombrotus prepared to make a stand on the Isthmus of Corinth by ordering his men to destroy the road leading through it and to build a defensive wall across the region. But as Athens was located in the region of Attica, located outside the wall, the Athenian citizens were ordered to abandon their city and evacuate to Salamis, and Themistocles was able to use the Athenian fleet to help out in the final stages of the evacuation. After the few remaining Athenians who barricaded themselves on the Acropolis were defeated, Xerxes ordered the city to be destroyed, and the Athenian Acropolis was razed to the ground, fulfilling another prophecy of the oracle at Delphi. Although Leonidas's stand at Thermopylae ended in defeat, and Xerxes' army continued its advance, the heroic defense of the pass inspired the Greeks to fight on, and the 3 days of fighting at Thermopylae provided much-needed time for Themistocles to inflict significant damage to the Persian fleet. The Spartans and their Peloponnesian allies anticipated that the next phase of the war would follow in a similar vein to that of Thermopylae and Artemisium, with the Peloponnesian army fighting to hold the choke point at the Isthmus of Corinth, while the allied navy held the Persian fleet in check at Salamis. But Themistocles had other ideas and believed it was possible to end the war by destroying the Persian fleet. Although he had received reinforcements since Artemisium and commanded a fleet of almost 400 ships, Themistocles was still outnumbered by the Persians. During the Battle of Salamis in late September, the Allied navy managed to win a decisive victory over the Persians, sinking over 200 enemy ships in the process. The naval battle marked the turning point of the war and prompted Xerxes to return home with much of his army, fearing that the Greek fleet might sail up the Hellespont and destroy his pontoon bridges to trap him in Greece. While Xerxes personally abandoned the campaign, the war was not yet over, and the Persians continued to occupy much of the Greek peninsula. The great king left behind a large force under the command of his cousin Mardonius, the same man who had led the invasion of Thrace in 492 BC. Now Mardonius evacuated Attica and spent the winter in Thessaly, while the Athenians reoccupied their native city and the Peloponnesians remained behind the Isthmus wall. Since the Athenians lacked the protection of the Isthmus wall, they urged the Spartans to lead an army north to attack and defeat Mardonius. When the Spartans refused, the Athenians withdrew their navy from the allied fleet, enabling King Leotychidas of Sparta to take command. In early 479 BC, Mardonius aimed to exploit the disagreements among the allies by sending a peace offering promising freedom to the Athenians. But this was rejected, prompting the Persian general to reoccupy Athens and completely destroy the city. The Athenian refugees appealed for military assistance from the Spartans, threatening to accept the Persian terms if none was given. After overseeing the completion of the Isthmus wall, Cleombrotus returned to Sparta and died soon afterwards, leaving his son, Pausanias, as regent and commander of the allied army. Pausanias raised an army of some 70,000 men, which marched north from the Isthmus, where they were joined by 8,000 Athenian hoplites. While Mardonius hoped to do battle on the open plains near Plataea, Pausanias managed to occupy a position on the heights overlooking the Persian camp. The two armies faced each other for several days before the Greeks decided on a strategic retreat to secure their lines of communication. As the Greeks were retreating in different directions, Mardonius led his army up the heights in pursuit. But, as at Thermopylae, the lightly armed Persians proved no match for the Greek hoplites, and Mardonius was killed in battle alongside more than half his army of some 120,000 men. At around the same time, King Leotychidas sought battle with the Persian fleet and caught up to it at the foot of Mount Mycale in Ionia. Rather than do battle on their damaged ships, the Persian sailors joined a large army Xerxes had left there and did battle with the Spartans on foot with predictable consequences. The twin victories of Plataea and Mycale definitively ended any further attempts by Xerxes and his successors to invade Greece, and the invasion was abandoned. After the Persians evacuated Greece, the Greeks erected a stone lion at Thermopylae in memory of Leonidas, near the spot where he fell. They also raised a monument commemorating the dead with an epitaph composed by the poet Simonides, which read, quote, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to our laws we lie." Around 40 years after the battle, a Spartan delegation sent to Thermopylae recovered the supposed remains of Leonidas and carried them back to Sparta for reburial in a grand funeral. While the Spartans worshipped all their kings as semi-divine beings after their deaths, in later centuries Leonidas was given the additional honor of an annual festival in his name, the Leonidaea. The focal point of the Spartan worship of the cult of Leonidas was a building known as the Leonidaion, which may have contained the funerary monuments of Leonidas and Pausanias, the two preeminent Spartan heroes of the Persian Wars. Even though we know very little about his life, in the centuries after his death, Leonidas served as a reminder to the Spartans of their former glory. The Roman emperors sought inspiration from the warrior tradition of Sparta, and the Leonidaea festival was revived during the reign of Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century AD. The Greek historian and biographer Plutarch wrote a life of Leonidas, which has regrettably not survived. The legacy of Leonidas extends beyond the ancient world. During the Italian Renaissance, the independent city-states, threatened by French and German invasion, were inspired by Leonidas and the 300 as defenders of liberty against foreign tyranny. In the late 16th century, the prolific French essayist Michel de Montaigne claimed that Salamis, Plataea, and other Greek victories against Persia paled in comparison to the glorious defeat of King Leonidas and his men in the pass of Thermopylae. In 1814, the French neoclassical painter Jacques-Louis David completed his canvas of Leonidas at Thermopylae. Although his patron, Napoleon Bonaparte, was initially puzzled as to why David would choose as his heroic subject an ancient warrior who succumbed to defeat, he later recognized the power of the Spartans' patriotic sacrifice. The example would have seemed extremely relevant as David completed his painting after Napoleon fought a valiant but ultimately unsuccessful campaign defending France from invasion by a coalition of Austrian, Prussian, and Russian armies. In his epic poem, Don Juan, the English romantic poet Lord Byron, who championed and later perished in the cause of Greek liberation, laments the lack of valor among his contemporary Greeks. Earth, render back from out thy breast a remnant of our Spartan dead. Of the 300, grant but 3 to make a new Thermopylae. As the Royal Air Force faced the German Luftwaffe over the skies of southern England in the summer of 1940, Winston Churchill must have had Leonidas and the 300 in mind when he proclaimed, quote, "Never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few." Yet the legacy of Sparta was claimed not only by the Allies, but also by Nazi Germany. The organization of Spartan society, with a pure-born masterclass of warriors supported by an underclass of helots, served as a model for Hitler's racial utopia, and Hermann Goering alluded to the glory of the 300 when referring to the German Sixth Army surrounded by the Soviets at Stalingrad. The legacy of the Spartans, with Leonidas and the 300 as one of the most prominent examples, remains controversial and complex. While the 300 have gone down in history as the heroes of Thermopylae, the Helots and Perioeci, who had no choice but to comply with Leonidas's orders to fight to the death, have largely been forgotten. In spite of all the legends that have emerged concerning Leonidas's life over the centuries, we know surprisingly little about him. As the third son of King Anaxandridas, he went through the rigorous agoge training program alongside his 2 brothers, and was brought up to follow the principles of Sparta's warrior culture, including a sense of honor and glory in death. At around the age of 50, he married his wife, Gorgo, the daughter of his half-brother King Cleomenes, and not long afterwards may have been involved in his deposition and death, following which Leonidas became one of Sparta's co-kings. He would have played a leading role in Spartan deliberations over how to deal with the Persian threat, but he does not come into focus until the invasion of 480 BC. As commander of an understrength Greek army, weakened by religious obligations and a reluctance to face the enormous Persian horde, he decided to make a stand at Thermopylae, despite the poor numerical odds, offering unbreakable resistance and inflicting a considerable amount of damage on the Persian army over 2 full days. Even after being outflanked, he decided against withdrawing his whole army and fought a desperate rearguard action that inflicted a disproportionate number of casualties on the enemy before succumbing to the last man. While Leonidas and his army were defeated at Thermopylae, their brave resistance inspired the Greeks to triumph over the Persians at Salamis and Plataea. What do you think of King Leonidas I of Sparta? Was he a defender of freedom against a despotic imperial enemy? Or was he himself a despot who ruled over a state which routinely oppressed and humiliated its subject peoples in order to preserve the privileges and culture of a small warrior elite? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The man known to history as King Xerxes I, or Xerxes the Great, was born around 518 BC within the Achaemenid dynasty, the rulers of the Persian Empire. The name Xerxes derives from a Greek transliteration of the Persian king's name, which may be rendered more accurately as Kshay-Asha. That he has become known as Xerxes highlights the manner in which his interactions with the Greek world would frame his life and reign, and Xerxes is best known for his role in the second Persian invasion of Greece in the late 480s BC. He featured prominently in Herodotus's histories, widely regarded as the earliest work of systematic historical inquiry in Western literature. This work of both historical discussion and social anthropology is our greatest source for Xerxes' life, though Herodotus often coloured his accounts with highly fantastical details. Xerxes' father, Darius I, also known as Darius the Great, King of Kings, ruled the Achaemenid Empire between 522 BC and 486 BC. Son of a powerful Persian nobleman, Darius had come to power in a coup to claim control over the Persian Empire, which itself had only emerged a few decades earlier, rising out of the area that is modern-day Iran to conquer the Babylonian Empire and much of the Middle East. Darius ruled over the Persian Empire at its greatest territorial extent, though he is best known for the failure of his attempt to conquer the Greeks, which ended with his defeat to the Athenians in the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC during the first Persian invasion of Greece. His mother, Atossa, was the daughter of Cyrus II, or Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire. Darius had married Atossa shortly after becoming king in an effort to strengthen his rather tenuous claim to his throne. The couple had 4 sons, of whom Xerxes was the eldest. Darius also had several other children from 5 other wives, one of whom he married before he became king. Although Persian women could not hold political office in their own right, Atossa was Darius's favourite wife and wielded considerable unofficial authority at court. The manner in which Darius came to rule over the Persian Empire remains a subject of historical dispute. Cyrus the Great's son and successor, Cambyses II, had died childless in July 522 BC. Although Cambyses had a younger brother named Bardia, Herodotus claims that Cambyses had him put to death as he was afraid that Bardia might rebel against him. This was not widely known, so a priest named Gaumata, who resembled Bardia, assumed his identity and claimed the throne as Cambyses' successor. Then, several months later, a nobleman named Otanes apparently uncovered the king's real identity and brought together a group of 7 plotters to eliminate him. Among the 7 was Darius, who had previously served in the prestigious role of King Cambyses' lance-bearer. The plotters tracked the false king down to the fort of Sikyavortish, and Darius himself struck the mortal blow. The plotters then drew lots to determine who would be king, from which Darius emerged as the winner. In 520 BC, Darius left his own account of his rise to power in an inscription on the slopes of Mount Bisutun in western Iran, in which he claimed to have vanquished 9 rebellious kings across the empire in a single year, of which Gaumata, or Bardia, was the first. Darius begins by establishing his ancestry, claiming a common ancestry to that of Cyrus the Great, with both men ultimately stemming from the line of Achaemenes, who gave his name to the Achaemenid Empire. Darius therefore justified his actions by claiming that he was restoring his family to the throne. Many classical and Persian scholars alike, though, have questioned this tale and consider it a piece of monumental propaganda on the part of Darius to cover up the fact that he had usurped the throne and killed the real Bardia. There is almost no information about Xerxes' life before he became king at the age of 32 in 486 BC. In his biography of Xerxes, the British historian Richard Stoneman used the education of Cyrus, the partly fictionalized biography of Cyrus the Great by the Athenian general and writer Xenophon from the early 4th century BC, as the basis for Xerxes' education and upbringing. The core elements of a Persian noble's military education included horsemanship and fighting with bow and spear on foot and on horseback. Noble children were taught the main principle of Zoroastrianism, the empire's state religion. Based on the teachings of the semi-mythical prophet Zoroaster, Zoroastrians worshipped one supreme god, Ahura Mazda, who created the world and used truth to give it order. Ahura Mazda is involved in a constant struggle against Ahriman, the evil spirit responsible for falsehoods. Persian princes like Xerxes would therefore have been taught to consider telling the truth a sacred obligation, with lying and deceit equivalent to heresy. While Zoroaster's teachings formed a key part of the Persian state religion, especially during the reigns of Darius and Xerxes, the Persians continued to believe in a wide pantheon of traditional gods, though their drift towards quasi-monotheism was a striking forerunner of what would occur with Christianity in the Eastern Mediterranean centuries later. According to the first Alcibiades, a Socratic dialogue loosely attributed to the Greek philosopher Plato, Persian princes were brought up by eunuchs until the age of 14, when they would begin receiving lessons from tutors chosen from the aristocracy. As the Persians had a strong oral tradition, there is no indication that Xerxes would have been taught to read and write, and anything that needed to be recorded in writing was done by imperial scribes. At the age of 16 or 17, young Persian nobles would then spend a period of 10 years practicing military drills and going hunting. From their mid-20s, they would serve as the king's soldiers before transferring to civil and administrative roles in their early 50s. Xerxes' mother, Atossa, had a major influence on his life, and she may have been behind his marriage to Amestris, the daughter of Atanes, the man who had helped Darius in his coup of 522 BC. The ancient sources are silent about Amestris' childhood and upbringing, nor do they give any dates for her marriage to Xerxes. Xerxes' father's empire was vast. It was only founded in 559 BC by Cyrus the Great, when he led his followers from Persis, a region corresponding to Fars province in the south of modern-day Iran, westwards to conquer the Babylonian Empire in Mesopotamia in modern-day Iraq. Over the next years, the Persians continued to expand in all directions, though primarily to the west. By the early 540s BC, the Persians had reached the borders of the realms of King Croesus of Lydia in what is now Turkey. There, they occupied his capital of Sardis in 547 BC, extending Cyrus's emerging empire to the Aegean. This might have led to an immediate clash between the Persians and the hundreds of small Greek city-states that ringed the Aegean Sea, including the coastline of western Turkey, but instead, Cyrus turned his attentions elsewhere, completing his conquest of the Babylonians and their lands in places like Syria and the Levant. His son and successor, Cambyses II, then looked further southwestwards and campaigned into Egypt. By the time Xerxes' father Darius came to the throne, the Persian Empire stretched from Egypt all the way east to parts of Central Asia and from the Black Sea south to northern Arabia. Though it was a decentralized empire ruled by individual junior kings or satraps who paid homage to Darius and would do so to Xerxes as well one day when he succeeded his father. Shortly before that accession would occur, Darius turned his eyes to the Greeks of the Aegean. Though there was no individual power within the Greek world that could in any way match the Persians militarily, the Greeks were still a powerful people, having colonized large parts of the Mediterranean and Black Sea and become rich from their extensive trade and commerce. From amongst them, the Athenians were the emerging mercantile and naval power, though the Spartans of the Peloponnese were regarded as the most proficient military warriors of the known world. In the 500s and 490s BC, Darius had begun slowly conquering some of the Greek city-states of the Ionian coast of Anatolia in western Turkey. Some of these revolted against Persian rule in 498 BC, leading several of the more powerful Greek city-states further to the west on the Greek mainland to send aid to them, notably the Athenians. The Persians responded with a series of punitive campaigns targeting the Ionian city-states, and by 493 BC, the rebellion had been fully extinguished. The following year, Darius decided that his vengeance had not gone far enough, and attempted to conquer the whole of the Greek world by sending an invasion force under the Persian general Mardonius. While Mardonius managed to secure the submission of Thrace and Macedonia in northern Greece, a storm near Mount Athos resulted in the loss of hundreds of ships and forced him to turn back. Unperturbed, in 490 BC, Darius ordered a new naval campaign across the Aegean, one which ended with the unexpected Athenian victory at the Battle of Marathon east of Athens itself. Yet, while the first Persian invasion of Greece had failed, neither Darius nor his son would forget about the Greeks, and Xerxes became committed to launching a much more extensive military campaign against the people of the Aegean. In 486 BC, while Darius was planning another campaign against the Greek city-states, the king fell ill and died. Xerxes' path to the kingship was more straightforward than his father's, although it had not been uncontested. Xerxes had 3 elder half-brothers from Darius's first marriage, the eldest of whom, Artabazanes, also claimed he had a right to be his father's successor. Xerxes argued that he had the strongest claim to the throne, as he was the first of Darius's sons to be born when their father was already king, and that his mother Atossa had royal blood as the daughter of Cyrus the Great. According to Herodotus, the Persians did not follow the principle of the firstborn male son succeeding the father, and Darius had nominated Xerxes as his successor while preparing to go on his final campaign, though he adds that such was Atossa's influence at court that Xerxes would have become king in any case. While Herodotus claims that Darius had nominated Xerxes shortly before his death, reliefs on Darius's palaces in Persepolis already show Xerxes as crown prince, indicating that the nomination was made years in advance. Thus, Xerxes faced no internal opposition when he succeeded his father on the throne. The only ancient description of a Persian king's coronation is found in the Greek historian Plutarch's biography of King Artaxerxes II, the great-grandson of Xerxes I. We can extrapolate some ideas about how Xerxes' coronation was carried out from Plutarch's account. After a period of mourning for his late father that ended in Darius's burial at Persepolis, one of 4 Persian capitals, Xerxes was crowned king at nearby Pasargadae, Cyrus's capital and burial place in southern Iran. The ceremony may have been held at the shrine of the goddess Anahita, the Iranian goddess of wisdom and warfare. The eternal flame of the Zoroastrians that had been extinguished following Darius's death were lit once again. After being invested as king in a ceremony hidden from view inside the sanctuary, Xerxes would have placed upon his shoulders the robe of Cyrus the Great before descending the stairs into the presence of the awaiting crowd. The ceremony was followed by a grand feast accompanied by music. The Persian court which Xerxes now assumed to the height of did not stay in a single location, and the king spent the year moving between 3 or 4 capitals. The king's summer capital was the old Median capital of Ecbatana, while in winter the court travelled to Susa, the capital of the former Elamite kingdom in southwestern Iran, which the Greeks considered the center of Persian power. The king may have stayed in Persepolis for parts of the spring and autumn, and may have also spent part of the year in Babylon. The empire had an extensive road network to facilitate communication, and the Persian Royal Road enabled couriers to cover the 1,500 miles between Sardis and Susa within 3 months. With the exception of the Greek cities in the west, the empire's economy was predominantly agrarian. The Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote that Persian satraps accumulated wealth from land, local produce, herding, trade, and the collection of various dues and taxes, portions of which were then sent to the king. The empire's wealth was therefore concentrated with the king and in his capitals, contributing to the splendor and ostentation that the Greeks considered decadent. Although the Greeks saw the Persians as their great external enemy, from the core of the Persian Empire, the Greeks were little more than a nuisance on the distant western frontier who deserved to be taught a lesson when they rebelled against the king. While the Persian kings were autocratic rulers, no single individual could hope to govern such a large empire without many officials. In the case of the Persian Empire, the imperial staff consisted of some 15,000 people who accompanied the king as he moved between his capitals. The king sought advice on important political and military issues from a council of 7, many of whom came from noble families closely connected to the royal family. The system of satrapies allowed the king to project his power from his capitals to the provinces. In an effort to prevent the satraps from acting too independently and challenging the king's authority, Xerxes also appointed an official to shadow each satrap and ensure they were carrying out their functions properly. Another prominent part of the imperial staff were the eunuchs, whose primary function was to control access to the royal women. The king and his court were protected by an elite bodyguard known as the Immortals, who received their name from the fact that their strength always remained constant at 10,000 men, as every man killed in action was immediately replaced. The Immortals not only provided internal security for the king and his court, but served as an elite heavy infantry unit on the battlefield. Like Louis XIV at Versailles or the Chinese emperor in the Forbidden City, the daily life of Xerxes' court was designed to project an image of the king's greatness and power among his subjects and foreign dignitaries. Every morning, Xerxes put on his imperial robes and mounted his throne in the audience hall, where he was attended to by the Chiliarch, the senior official who managed the court proceedings. The king received petitioners from all over the empire, many of whom had to wait several days at the palace gate before being admitted to the king's presence. Most subjects were obliged to prostrate themselves in front of the king, a practice that was vehemently resisted by the Greeks, who developed a face-saving formula of pretending that they had dropped a ring before throwing themselves to the floor. The sense of grandeur was further enhanced by the palace gardens, and the creation of gardens as a representation of paradise has been a constant feature of Near Eastern empires throughout history, the most famous example being the enigmatic hanging gardens of Babylon. While some Persian princes are recorded as being personally involved in the cultivation of their gardens, there is no evidence that Xerxes himself was so hands-on. One of the best-known episodes in Xerxes' life involves his fondness for a particular tree in Sardis, which Herodotus described as of such beauty that the king was moved to decorate it with golden ornaments and to leave behind one of the Immortals to guard it. Soon after coming to the throne in 486 BC, Xerxes faced a revolt in Egypt and sent an army to put it down. Herodotus gives few details of the campaign, other than Xerxes installed his brother, Archaemenes, as satrap of Egypt. According to the Greek historian Ctesias, writing during the late 5th century BC, Xerxes also faced two separate revolts in Babylon led by kings named Belshazzar and Shamash-Ariba. The first was put down by an army led by the Persian general Megabyzus, while the second was put down by Xerxes himself. While there is some uncertainty about the dating of the two rebellions, many scholars believe that both took place within a 3-month period in the summer of 484 BC. After Xerxes recaptured Babylon in October, the Persian authorities attempted to secure its control of the region by suppressing the leading families of Babylon who had supported the rebel kings, before dividing the Babylonian satrapy into smaller administrative units to undermine any sense of shared identity among inhabitants of the old Babylonian kingdom. While Xerxes is traditionally believed to have sacked Babylon and its temples, taking away a prominent statue of the Babylonian god Marduk, more recent scholarship argues that this is a misinterpretation of Herodotus and there was no widespread destruction of the city. After suppressing these revolts, Xerxes was free to turn his attention to Greece for the first time in his reign and avenge the slights which his father had suffered in the 490s BC. According to Herodotus, Xerxes convened a council at Susa in around 483 BC to discuss the prospect of another invasion of Greece. The main spokesman in favor of war was Mardonius, Xerxes' cousin and leader of the 492 BC invasion, who hoped to become satrap of Greece once it was conquered. Mardonius also claimed that the Greeks were ignorant about war and only fought on the open field, meaning that the Persians were guaranteed victory due to superior numbers. Mardonius's arguments failed to take into account the Persian defeat at Marathon, and Xerxes' uncle Artabanus argued against going to war with the Greeks, since the Greek fleet would cut him off from his supply lines. While Xerxes reacted angrily to the suggestion that he could not gain victory, he had second thoughts, and it was only after he had multiple dreams telling him to launch the invasion that he chose to do so. The exiled king of Sparta, Demaratus, seems to have been part of these discussions, as he sent a secret message to his homeland warning the Spartans to expect a Persian invasion. Rather than an early warning for his former subjects, Demaratus's message might also have been intended to intimidate the Spartans into submission. Xerxes was not planning on surprising the Greeks, since he spent the next 2 years making extensive preparations for the campaign. Bridges were built over rivers in Thrace to facilitate the passage of the army, and a canal was dug through the Athos Peninsula to give the fleet a safer passage to avoid a repeat of Mardonius's disaster in 492 BC. By the spring of 481 BC, Xerxes and his army left Susa and proceeded to Sardis. After arriving there in the autumn of 481 BC, Xerxes and his army spent the winter taking on provisions until they were ready to move by the spring of 480 BC. While Greek writers, including Herodotus, claimed that Xerxes had millions of men in his army at this juncture, more realistic estimates suggest that the invasion force could not have been more than 200,000 men, though even this figure would have represented an enormous invasion force in the 5th century BC. The king's multinational army, including peoples as diverse as Libyans and Indians, in addition to the Greeks in Asia Minor, who were subjects of the Persian Empire. Each of these national contingents had their own distinctive dress and equipment, and all of these different peoples, marching under Xerxes' command, served as a demonstration of his claim to be king of the whole world. The core of the army were the Persians and Medes. In addition to the legendary 10,000 immortals, commanded by Hydarnes, a nobleman whose father of the same name had been one of Darius's co-conspirators in the coup that delivered him the throne decades earlier. The commanders on land and sea were drawn from the royal family, with Mardonius holding senior command of the army and Xerxes' elder half-brother Ariobanes as commander of the fleet. Herodotus claims that the Persian fleet consisted of 3,000 ships, including more than 1,200 triremes, the most popular form of warship in the ancient Mediterranean, named after the 3 banks of oars that gave them speed and agility in war. The largest naval contingents included the Egyptians, Palestinians and Phoenicians, an ancient people from modern-day Lebanon who were well known for their maritime prowess. Perhaps the most famous naval commander among the Persian allies was Queen Artemisia of Caria, who ruled Herodotus's native city of Halicarnassus and its surrounding islands, and commanded 5 ships. Artemisia was one of many Greek leaders who lived under Persian rule and contributed to Xerxes' invasion force. Despite attempts by Herodotus to present the conflict as a struggle between the autocratic Persians and the freedom-loving Greeks, it is probable that there were more Greeks fighting in Xerxes' army than those who remained independent and resisted the Persian invasion. Whether as a result of Demaratus's message or otherwise, the Greeks were well aware of Persian intentions, and representatives of the major Greek city-states met at the Isthmus of Corinth in the summer of 481 BC to form a coalition to resist Xerxes. While a total of 31 city-states joined the coalition, around half of these were Sparta's allies in its long-standing military alliance, known as the Peloponnesian League. Several important Greek states, such as Thebes and Argos, favoured negotiating with the Persians, but both Athens and Sparta were adamant that they needed to be resisted at all costs, and that Xerxes' great army could be defeated. The Spartans were led by their 2 kings, Leotychidas and Leonidas, while Themistocles emerged as the most prominent military leader among the Athenians over the course of the war. After leaving Sardis, Xerxes is said to have stopped at the fabled city of Troy on the coastline of western Turkey and to have listened there to tales of the Trojan War, though this story was almost certainly just a literary device used by Herodotus to associate the Persian Wars with the heroic age of Achilles and Hector, which also saw a clash between the European Greeks and the Trojans of Asia Minor. The army then marched west towards the Hellespont, the body of water separating Europe from Asia. Although a couple of pontoon bridges had been built earlier in the spring as part of the military preparations, they had been damaged by a storm. In an infamous episode, an enraged Xerxes not only ordered the execution of the chief engineers, but ordered his men to give the Hellespont 300 lashes. While this reaction is the subject of Greek mockery, it is consistent with Persian religious and political ideology, which regarded the king as the ruler of the natural elements. The king was punishing the sea for a hostile act in the same manner that he would punish rebellious subjects. While the bridges were being rebuilt, Xerxes arranged sporting competitions for his soldiers and followed the proceedings from a hill overlooking the straits. Once the bridge was repaired, the great Persian army crossed the Hellespont into Thrace. There, Xerxes conducted a final review of it at Dariscus, located near the modern-day border between Greece and Turkey, before the march began. After heading west into Macedonia, where he may have called on King Alexander I of Macedon to resupply his armies, Xerxes began his march south against the independent Greek states. While Xerxes had made extensive preparations to facilitate his army's progress through northern Greece, there were no attempts to improve the roads leading south, and the Persian army moved slowly. The leisurely pace may have been a deliberate choice by the king to show his overwhelming force and compel wavering Greek states to submit to him without a fight. In the meantime, the leaders of the Greek coalition had met again to consider their strategic options. While Sparta's allies in the Peloponnesian League favoured remaining behind the fortifications that had been built across the Isthmus of Corinth, turning the Peloponnese into a stronghold, others, like Athens, were adamant that a defensive line much further north was needed. The wider Greek alliance consequently adopted a proposal by the representatives of Thessaly to send 10,000 men to the Vale of Tempe, which separated the Thessalians from their Macedonian neighbours to the north. However, upon its arrival the commanders were informed that the position could be outflanked and hurriedly withdrew, prompting the wavering Thessalians to submit to the Persians. By early August it seemed as though the Greeks were set to fight at the Isthmus, which would mean abandoning Athens to its fate. The Greeks were also encumbered by their religious duties, with many city-states distracted by the religious festivals and sporting games held that year at Olympia, while the Spartans were observing the annual Carneia festival in honour of Apollo, one of the most important events on their religious calendar. In spite of this, and in response to a message from the Delphic oracle indicating that Sparta would fall unless one of its kings were to die in battle, one of its two reigning monarchs at the time, King Leonidas, led a few thousand men, including 300 elite Spartan soldiers, to Thermopylae, a narrow pass between the mountains and an inlet of the Aegean Sea. Leonidas knew that his small force could not win a decisive victory over the Persians, but it could still inflict heavy casualties on the attacking army and win time for the Greek allies to mount a defence behind the Isthmus. Knowing that it would be a suicide mission, Leonidas required each of the 300 men to have a son to carry on the family line. Leonidas picked up some allied contingents on the way to Thermopylae, and by the time he arrived he had a force of some 7,000 men under his command. As Xerxes approached the pass in mid-August, he could see the Spartans taking part in nude exercises and washing their hair. When King Demaratus informed Xerxes that such rituals indicated that the Spartans were preparing to fight to the death, the Persian king laughed derisively. Nevertheless, Xerxes waited several days to launch his first attack at Thermopylae, perhaps expecting the Greeks to fall back as they had done so at Tempe. Alternatively, Xerxes may have known that it would cost him heavy casualties to overcome the Spartan defenders occupying the narrow pass, and preferred a diplomatic solution as he sent an envoy to the Greek camp asking Leonidas to submit and lay down his arms in return for fertile lands in the Persian Empire. The Spartan king refused by famously challenging Xerxes to come and take them. Leonidas took up his position at the so-called Middle Gate, the narrowest section of the pass, where he restored an old defensive wall to strengthen his position. On around the 17th of August, Xerxes ordered his men to begin their assault on Thermopylae. The terrain naturally favoured the Greeks, since it prevented Xerxes from using his numerical superiority to its full extent. Accustomed to fighting on open ground, the main weapon of the Persian infantry were their bows, which would unleash volley after volley of arrows to soften the enemy before the Persian cavalry manoeuvred to strike at the flanks or to take advantage of gaps in the enemy defences created by the bowmen. In contrast, the Greek hoplites were heavily armoured with spears that gave them a longer reach than any of the Persian hand-to-hand weapons. The first Persian attack was launched by the Medes, the Persian arrows flying so thick that they allegedly blotted out the sun. The lightly armed Medes then closed in for the attack, but were repulsed by the Greek hoplites with heavy losses. Xerxes responded by throwing forward successive contingents of his multi-ethnic army into the attack, and though some of these were better suited to hand-to-hand combat, Leonidas's position remained impregnable. On occasion, Leonidas would order his men to stage feigned retreats in order to trap larger numbers of enemy troops in the pass. Infuriated at the lack of progress, Xerxes decided to send his immortals into the fray. But even they struggled to make progress against the formidable Greek defences. After 2 days of battle, a local shepherd informed Xerxes about a narrow mountain path that could be used to circumvent the Greek position. During the middle of the night, Hydarnes led his immortals over the road and overcame the weak Greek force guarding it. By the morning, they were approaching Leonidas's rear. In these desperate circumstances, Leonidas sent away any allied troops who did not wish to die and fought a last stand with his Spartans. The king led the 300 in front of the wall so they could deploy in a single line and attack the enemy in full force. According to Herodotus, 20,000 of Xerxes' men fell on the final morning of battle, but eventually the Spartans were killed one by one. After finding Leonidas's corpse, Xerxes ordered it to be mutilated and placed his head on a pole. Herodotus remarks that this was not a common practice among the Persians, suggesting that Xerxes was hugely angered by Leonidas's resistance and how costly defeating the Spartans at Thermopylae had proved. At around the same time, a naval action was fought at nearby Cape Artemisium to prevent another contingent of Xerxes' army from landing reinforcements at Thermopylae. The Persian fleet had already suffered considerable damage during a storm at Cape Sapias, resulting in the loss of around a third of the entire force. Although Themistocles had fewer than 300 triremes under his command, he adopted a circular formation with prows pointing outwards to make it impossible to outflank, and those Persian ships which attempted to do so were picked off in quick order. According to Herodotus, when Themistocles carved messages onto the rocks on the shore to persuade the Greek elements in the Persian fleet to defect, Xerxes responded by sending the Athenian naval commander a message inviting him to view the heaps of the unburied Greek dead at Thermopylae, warning that he would suffer a similar fate if he continued to fight. Although the Battle of Artemisium was tactically indecisive and the Persian navy was able to continue its southward progress, Themistocles had inflicted further losses upon the Persian fleet, which, in conjunction with the storm at Cape Sapias, reduced the Persian force to around half its initial size. Nevertheless, Xerxes maintained his numerical superiority on both land and sea and marched towards Athens with his main force. A Persian detachment was sent towards Delphi to plunder the sanctuary, but in an intervention credited to the god Apollo, a landslide at Mount Parnassus buried much of the Persian force alive, and the remainder fled from the scene. After securing the submission of the Boeotians in central Greece, Xerxes' army approached the Athenian heartland of Attica and proceeded to ravage the countryside. By this time, the city of Athens itself was largely empty. A delegation of Athenians had been to the oracle at Delphi and received a message which suggested that while the enemy would occupy the city, the Athenian population would be safe from the Persians behind its, quote, wooden wall. While a large number of Athenians believed that this meant they should rebuild a wooden wall around the Acropolis in the center of their city, Themistocles believed that the wooden wall referred to the Athenian navy. A large deposit of silver had recently been discovered at Laurium in southeast Attica, and Themistocles proposed this newfound wealth should be used to build a large fleet. The issue went to a vote in the Athenian assembly, which adopted Themistocles' proposals. When news arrived that Xerxes was marching south from Thermopylae, Themistocles put his plan into action. Almost the entire population of Athens was conscripted to man the fleet, though Themistocles retained a token garrison on the Acropolis. The Persians established a position on the Areopagus, the rocky hill below the Acropolis, which hosted the Athenian noble council, from where they shot fire arrows at the Athenian citadel. While the garrison initially prevented the Persians from approaching by rolling boulders down the path, a Persian force gained entry elsewhere by scaling up a vertical rock. Xerxes' army then burned all the religious buildings on the Acropolis, including the Temple of Athena and the Old Parthenon. In the aftermath of the battle in September 480 BC, Xerxes dispatched a message to Susa announcing that the aid Athens had provided to the Ionians at the time of their revolt, nearly 20 years earlier, had finally been avenged. The city of Athens lay in ruins, but Xerxes was premature in thinking he had defeated the Athenians entirely. With his surviving ships from the Battle of Artemisium and additional reinforcements from the other Greek allies, Themistocles awaited the Persian fleet at the island of Salamis in the Saronic Gulf, west of Athens and south of the Isthmus of Corinth, where the main Greek army had now assembled and was preparing to face an assault on land. Although the turncoat Spartan king Demaratus had advised Xerxes to split his fleet in two and send a squadron to land an army on the Peloponnese, the Persian naval commanders, with the exception of Queen Artemisia, favoured keeping the fleet together. According to Herodotus, Themistocles had 380 triremes at Salamis, while the Persian fleet could not have numbered more than 600. The Battle of Salamis began on a late September morning in 480 BC, not long after Xerxes had entered the burning ruins of Athens in seeming triumph. The right wing of the Greek fleet broke through the Persian line, and the rest of the Greek ships followed to encircle the enemy. With little room for manoeuvre in the narrow straits, the Phoenician ships bore the brunt of the action, and many were sunk. As he observed proceedings from a nearby hill, Xerxes must surely have struggled to believe what was happening. The Persian fleet was in disarray, and its commander, Ariabines, had been killed in action. In order to get away, Artemisia had to ram one of her own ships, making the captain of an approaching Greek ship believe that hers was an allied ship. The defeat of the Persian fleet at Salamis not only caused Xerxes to abandon any thought of offensive action, but led him to fear that he and what remained of his army could now have their lines of supply cut off at the Hellespont. Panicking, he ordered a northwards retreat and did not try to engage the Greek land army at the Isthmus of Corinth. Thereafter, he hurried back to Persia, but the king left Mardonius behind in Thessaly with an army to resume the campaign the following spring. The rest of the army crossed back into Asia via the Hellespont and suffered considerably from lack of supplies and food as winter approached. Herodotus includes an anecdote concerning Xerxes' homeward journey, which indicates that the king made part of the homeward journey by ship, perhaps due to the lack of supplies on the land route. When the ship was caught up in a storm, the captain informed the king that the ship was overloaded and risked sinking. When Xerxes addressed the passengers and said they had an opportunity to demonstrate their concern for the safety of their king, most of the passengers allegedly jumped overboard, and the ship survived the crossing. After arriving safely in Asia, Xerxes gave the captain a gold crown for saving the king's life before executing him for causing the deaths of a shipload of Persians. Queen Artemisia had earlier advised Xerxes to return to his empire and to leave Mardonius and some 100,000 men behind. If Mardonius were to be successful, then the glory would belong to Xerxes for expanding his empire. If Mardonius were to be defeated or killed in battle, it would make little difference to the king and the Persian Empire. As far as Xerxes was concerned, he had sacked Athens, and that was enough of a victory for him to save face and claim some minimal victory at the least. When Mardonius began his campaign in around June 479 BC, after a long hiatus in the winter and spring of 479 BC, the Athenians once again evacuated the city, allowing the Persians to sack it for a second time. Rather than pressing on to the Peloponnese in late July, Mardonius decided to retreat to the friendly territory of Thebes. Although the Greeks had intended to fight a defensive battle at the Isthmus, the Spartan general Pausanias now led a large army northwards and confronted Mardonius at Plataea, near Thebes. Pausanias staged a feigned retreat to encourage Mardonius to go on the offensive, before the Greek hoplites maintained their positions and cut down the Persian infantry, and the Persian commander was killed by a stone from a Spartan slinger. On the same day as the Battle of Plataea, a Greek fleet commanded by King Leotychidas of Sparta defeated the Persians at Mycale in Asia Minor. In an effort to avoid a repeat of Salamis, the Persian fleet had come ashore and established a fortified position at Mount Mycale, but the Greeks proceeded to set fire to both the Persians' ships and the fort at Mycale, massacring the defenders in the process. Since leaving Greece, Xerxes had remained at Sardis for a year. It was here that he received word of the twin defeats at Plataea and Mycale, following which he decided to abandon all thoughts of conquering Greece and returned to Susa. The second Persian invasion of Greece, which clearly involved a much larger army than the first a decade earlier, had ended in dramatic defeat for Xerxes. For the next 20 years, the Greeks launched frequent raids into Asia Minor, taking control of a handful of cities in the process, taking the fight to Xerxes. They also extensively celebrated the defeat of the Persian invasion as a great victory, with Thermopylae and Salamis in particular being hailed by the Spartans and Athenians as demonstrations of Greek martial prowess and the successful liberation of Greece from the despotic Oriental invader they perceived Xerxes as being. It was therefore natural for the Greek playwright Aeschylus to show the defeated Persian soldiers returning to Susa in rags at the end of the campaign in his play The Persians. However, some classical scholars speculate there may have been a Persian tradition that celebrated the second invasion of Greece in 480 BC and 479 BC as a victory. If Xerxes' primary motivation was to seek revenge for the Athenian sacking of Sardis, then the sacking of Athens in successive years had achieved that objective. But we should not be fooled. Xerxes had failed in his ultimate objective of conquering the Greek city-states entirely. As Xerxes turned his back on Greece, the Greeks also turned their backs on him, and despite the fact that Xerxes' reign lasted another 15 years, he hardly gets a mention in the Greek texts after 479 BC. As Herodotus and other writers fail to mention him thereafter, we consequently have very limited information concerning his later rule. We do know that in the aftermath of the Greek campaign, Xerxes turned his attention to another aspect of his father's unfinished work, the grand construction projects in the imperial capitals of Susa and Persepolis. The city of Persepolis was a relatively recent creation, and while the site may have been chosen by Cyrus, construction work was started in around 515 BC, early in the reign of Darius the Great. The earliest buildings on the site are the Great Stairway and the Apadana, the king's audience hall, which was modelled on a similar structure that had just been completed in Susa. These edifices were built on high ground above the plain, and in the early 5th century BC, work began on an artificial terrace at the same level, 15 metres above the ground, and faced with a limestone wall, creating a site 300 metres wide and 455 metres long. Xerxes probably began construction work in Persepolis immediately after becoming king, employing craftsmen from all over the empire to build and decorate the palaces. While Xerxes completed his father's unfinished buildings, his conception for the city was on an even grander scale. He blocked Darius's entrance in the south and instead built an entrance to the northwest with a gentle incline leading towards the monumental Gate of All Nations, flanked by 2 winged bulls. The gateway is located at a right angle to the northern facade of the vast Apadana, completed by Xerxes, which could accommodate an estimated 10,000 people. The 2 staircases to the east and north leading to the structure bear inscriptions by Xerxes that stated, "Proclaims Xerxes the great king, by the favour of Ahura Mazda, my father Darius the king built and ordered to be built much that is beautiful, and similarly, by the will of Ahura Mazda, I added to that work and built more." The stairways are decorated with reliefs of processions of guards and foreign dignitaries bringing tribute from across the king's vast domains. The centre of each staircase featured an image of the king on his throne, facing to the right, with the crown prince following behind. There is no consensus on whether the king depicted is Darius, with Xerxes as crown prince behind him, or if Xerxes himself is occupying the throne. To the east of the Apadana stood another monumental public building of 70 square metres known as the Hall of 100 Columns, which remained unfinished at the end of Xerxes' reign and which was only completed by his son and successor Artaxerxes I. The edifice may have initially served as a hall for the king to receive his military commanders, but was later used as a storeroom for valuable artifacts. The palace of Darius, the king's private residence, is located in the southwestern corner of the palace complex and features images of Darius as king and Xerxes as crown prince. Throughout his construction work in Persepolis, Xerxes seems to have been motivated by a desire to outdo his father, and it was no different when it came to their private palaces. The palace of Xerxes is located opposite the palace of Darius and is twice as large, covered in inscriptions stating that Xerxes was responsible for its construction. The adjacent building to the east is known as the harem, since one of the images shows the king attended by a eunuch, but while the structure may have housed the royal women, Persian kings did not have the sort of harems later associated with the Ottoman sultans. While the Greeks claimed that the kings of Persia had 360 concubines, one for each day of the year, there is no evidence for this, and the tale may stem from Greek writers' desire to portray Persian kings as hedonists, more concerned with their carnal desires than the affairs of state. The vast treasury building, measuring 120 metres by 60 metres, is located at the southeastern corner of Persepolis. This was where the royal archives and gifts from tributaries were stored. This was one of the earliest buildings dating from the reign of Darius, though Xerxes made extensive alterations and opened a new entrance to the east. The central part of Persepolis is occupied by an enigmatic building, the function of which is unknown. As a result, it is known by a number of different names, including the Central Palace, the Council Hall, and the Triplon, or Triple Gate. It could have simply served as a gate at the crossroads connecting the major buildings on the site, or it could have been a venue for the king to meet important officials. While construction was begun by Xerxes, it was completed by Artaxerxes, whose image is shown by all 4 doors. Despite all of Xerxes' monumental architecture, there is still some mystery surrounding the purpose of Persepolis. The fact that the city is rarely mentioned in the Greek sources until the 4th century BC gives the impression that it was not a center of political significance. The Iranian archaeologist Shadak Razumjau argues that the city was entirely built for religious purposes, owing to the large number of inscriptions invoking Ahura Mazda. Other theories suggest that it was purely an administrative center or a fortified citadel that stored the wealth of the empire. Classical scholars like Richard Stoneman share the view that Persepolis was one of several capital cities that hosted the king for part of the year, but that there was a strong ceremonial and religious dimension to Persepolis, whose location in the Persian heartland, close to Cyrus's palaces, at Pasargadae was of symbolic importance to the Achaemenid dynasty. The early 20th century British statesman Lord George Curzon, who travelled through Persia as a young man and wrote about the history and politics of the region, eventually being made Viceroy of India, suggested that the king stayed in Persepolis in spring and held an annual ceremony to receive officials and tributaries at the start of the year, leading modern scholars to speculate that such ceremonies were related to Nowruz, or the Persian New Year. It has been argued that Xerxes' building work in Persepolis should be considered the major achievement of his reign. These monumental buildings would survive until 330 BC, when Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire and sacked the capital, supposedly in retribution for Xerxes' sacking of Athens 150 years earlier. Alexander seems to have deliberately targeted the palaces built by Xerxes, since Darius's palace remained largely unharmed. The Macedonian conqueror plundered the city's wealth, taking away 120,000 talents of gold and silver, carried by 3,000 camels and an unspecified number of mules. All of this was far into the future, but the Greeks continued to trouble Xerxes during his lifetime. The Greek alliance that had defeated Xerxes at Salamis and Plataea quickly broke up, with Sparta and Athens going their separate ways. Pausanias, the victor of Plataea, led a campaign in Asia Minor and captured the city of Byzantium, but he was soon seduced by Persian ways and ruled the city like a Persian satrap. This encouraged Xerxes to use Pausanias as his agent in Greece, but before he could do so, the Spartan general was recalled and eventually starved to death in captivity in around 476 BC. The other Greek hero, Themistocles, likewise ended up becoming a friend of Persia. He had made himself unpopular in Athens in the years following the end of the war and was ultimately ostracized from his native city. He eventually went to Persia. After arriving in Susa, he was received by the king, though the Greek sources are in conflict over whether this was Xerxes or his successor Artaxerxes I. At any rate, the king gave Themistocles the governorship of 3 estates in Asia Minor. According to the 1st century BC Greco-Roman historian Diodorus Siculus, Xerxes invited Themistocles to lead a new campaign into Greece. In 466 BC, after the Athenian general Cimon captured several cities in Asia Minor, Xerxes organized a force to confront the new threat. The armies clashed at the river Eurymedon in what is now southern Turkey, and Cimon won a decisive victory on land and sea. This was Xerxes' final campaign, and in early August 465 BC, he was assassinated in his bed, dying at the age of 53. All the Greek accounts attribute the murder to a man named Artabanus, an important military and political figure at Xerxes' court. In order to eliminate Xerxes' eldest son, the crown prince Darius, Artabanus told Artaxerxes that Darius had killed his father, prompting the young prince to kill his elder brother in response. Artaxerxes became king, and Artabanus may have served as regent for some time, but a few months later the new king eliminated Artabanus. A Babylonian tablet of the time states that Xerxes' son killed him and suggests that Artaxerxes may have used Artabanus as a scapegoat to cover up his own role in his father's death. The circumstances of Xerxes' death can also be connected with Herodotus's claim that soon after returning to Susa in 479 BC, Xerxes began an affair with his young daughter-in-law, Artainte, Darius's wife. If the affair had been carrying on for the rest of Xerxes' reign, both Darius and Xerxes' wife, Queen Amestris, would have had a motive to get rid of him. In this interpretation, Amestris was the mastermind of the whole plot, first plotting with Darius to kill Xerxes, and then enabling Artaxerxes to avenge his father. Artaxerxes would rule for the next 40 years, a time of general stability in the Persian Empire, despite the further loss of territories on the frontiers. King Xerxes I of Persia has not been treated kindly by historians, both in ancient and modern times. The ancient Greeks cast him in the role of the villain, making him an overconfident autocrat and religious zealot on a bid for world domination, who was fatally undermined by his poor decision-making and his pleasure-seeking tendencies. This narrative was adopted by liberal writers of the 18th and 19th centuries, who saw the examples of Thermopylae and Salamis as symbols of defiance against imperial autocracy. In all such accounts, Xerxes has become the paragon of the Oriental despot, a cliché which abounds even in some modern films. Seen from the Persian heartland, however, Xerxes was a man who may have suffered military setbacks here and there, but otherwise helped to consolidate control over much of the Persian Empire and brought it to the height of its cultural grandeur with his monumental construction program at Persepolis. In Persepolis, Xerxes presented himself as ruler of the world. By sacking Xerxes' palaces more than a century later, Alexander the Great was laying his own claim to be master of the world. Unfortunately, we will never have a complete picture of who Xerxes was, but we can speculate that there was more to him as a ruler than the version of the Oriental despot presented by Herodotus. What do you think of King Xerxes I of Persia? To what extent was he the Oriental despot of Greek caricature who cared only about wine and women and neglected political affairs? Was his building program at Persepolis a further demonstration of imperial megalomania, or was it instead a reflection of the stability of Xerxes' rule? Please, let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Thank you for watching People Profiles Documentaries. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notifications so you never miss an upload. If you would like to watch our videos with no adverts of any kind, listen to audio podcast versions of our videos, discuss history with other People Profiles fans, and much more, go to peopleprofiles.com and become a member for as little as $2 per month. Members can also receive discounted merchandise, behind-the-scenes material, and a credit in our videos, along with much more. So, please support us in our work in return for exclusive offers at peopleprofiles.com via the link in the video description. Thank you very much for watching.